Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay, and in today's podcast, I'll be reading an essay called Amazing Grace, and it is taken from my book, The Farthest Reaches of Inner Space, A Course in Miracles and the Postmodern World. In this essay, I'll go through a few definitions of grace. We have the classic definition of it being God's favour. We have the Course in Miracles definition, and we also have a Jungian definition. So the essay starts with this quote from Carl Jung. For me, as a psychologist, the state of grace exists. It is the perfect serenity of the soul, a creative equilibrium, the source of spiritual energy. End of quote. And now I'll go on and read the rest of the essay. Attending Catholic schools as a child, I had little introduction to the variety of Protestant religions. In religious education class, we touched on Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, even Confucianism, but Protestantism was a no-go. Watching the documentary A Return to Grace, Luther's Life and Legacy recently, I was therefore fascinated to learn how the Protestant movement began and the vital importance of grace to its philosophical underpinnings. The movement's origins lie in 16th century Germany, with one man's quest to know what it meant to be a good person. That man was Martin Luther, a Catholic monk who, since boyhood, had been haunted by the idea of original sin and of a punitive, wrathful God. After entering the seminary as a young man, his fear of an all-powerful God with impossibly high standards made him obsessed with cataloguing his wrongs so he could atone for them. He beat himself, fasted for days, slept outside in the cold, and he basically endured extreme austerity for the sake of appeasing God. Absolution through the rite of confession gave him little reassurance. He'd often return to the confessional shortly after leaving because he'd forgotten something else to divulge. Because Luther's prevailing image of God was of an angry father with impossible standards, Luther hated God. No doubt this added to his sense of unworthiness and guilt. Jesus' first commandment, after all, in the Bible was, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." Luther must have felt he was failing miserably at his vocation. Luther also hated St. Paul for his letter to the Romans, in which he wrote, quote, "The righteous will live by faith alone," end of quote. Luther thought righteous referred to the grim God he hated, and that our faith must be a gift to that God. Luther meditated day and night on this passage, losing sleep over it, until everything seemed to change in an instant as he saw Paul's words in a different light. Subtitle: Eureka. Luther's paradigm shift came by reinterpreting the word righteous to refer to God's gift to us, which we receive through faith alone. We didn't need to earn God's favour by doing good deeds, nor did we need to compensate for our shortcomings, because, according to Luther, Jesus had already secured this for us through his crucifixion. Luther finally understood that our faith in Jesus' redemptive life opens the way for divine grace. We are already and always worthy. The gift of salvation has been given. We just need to realise that we'd be better off accepting grace, better off letting it infuse our lives and guide our actions. The idea that we don't need to do anything to deserve God's grace was a monumental shift from the Catholic Church's emphasis on penance, suffering, and perpetual sacrifice as paths to salvation. Devotees no longer had to tie themselves in knots of anxiety, wondering if they'd done enough to please God and avoid the fires of hell. However, Luther's theory of grace wasn't just personally liberating, it was politically explosive as well. It undermined the church's power, which had claimed the authority to tell people how to be worthy. So that's actually a big difference. The church is saying you need to do good works to be worthy. You need to do acts of penance and contrition to be worthy. Whereas Luther is saying you are already worthy. It's by faith alone in God and His grace that will avail you of His grace. Faith is the key with Luther, whereas with the church it was good works. And this meant the emphasis on good works, or doing things to secure your salvation and God's grace, that emphasis meant that the church could start selling what was called indulgences. An indulgence was a waiving of a penance. So let's say you confessed to doing something, and the priest might say, do some fasting, do this praying, in those days, wear a sackcloth, a very uncomfortable, itchy thing, and ashes all over your skin. These are kind of means of suffering to do penance for your sin. Well, the church came up with the indulgences as a way of wavering. You could not have to do all that if you gave some money to the church. That was what an indulgence was. You'd give money to pay for an indulgence, which meant a priest would pray for you or give you, that blessing whereby all your sins would be forgiven and you wouldn't have to do the good works or the penance. Now, Luther looked around him and he saw a lot of very, very poor people paying for these indulgences for loved ones to get to heaven. Maybe they do some praying themselves, but there was this emphasis on the magical effect of a priest or an indulgence securing. It's like a guarantee that sin has been paid off, has been forgiven because the penance has been done by way of indulgence. It's had the golden touch of the priest's hand, if you like. This really angered Luther because he felt that it was taking advantage of the people, and he knew that the church at the time was being led by Pope Leo X, and he was a member of the high-living Medici family. There was a lot of corruption within the church at that time, which he was aware of, and there was a lot of extravagant spending by the Medici family, and that's where he could see the money going. It was also going to rebuild St. Peter's Church, but at the same time, the members of the Medici family, including Pope Leo X, were living they were living the high life. Now we'll come to the second subtitle, Waking to Redemption, the Forgiveness Process. That grace is something available to us now, that God asks nothing of us in the way of payment, is an idea shared by A Course in Miracles. The Course defines grace as, quote, an aspect of the love of God which is most like the state prevailing in the unity of truth. Grace is also described as acceptance of the love of God within a world of seeming hate and fear. And so, by this acceptance, we transcend hate and fear. Faith in our unimpeded, eternal state of grace is the answer to our distress, though it takes a long time to develop. Luther believed that the Holy Spirit creates and strengthens faith, which transforms us. According to Luther, if we are in a state of grace now, we can be free from fear and therefore free to love, and Jesus serves as a model for this. Unfortunately, some Lutherans were so zealous in pursuit of this ideal, wafting about with an air of purity and detachment, that critics said they had become angelic to avoid having to do human labour. In other words, the love and peace expressed by the most zealous seemed contrived and may have been an excuse to evade the drudgery of everyday life. So this was the downside of followers of Luther believing that, we are already in a state of grace. All we have to do is have faith. They then walked around as if they were angelic beings, and the criticism was they're wafting around like that because they don't want to do hard day's work. It was like they were acting out the part of an ethereal being in a state of grace, which wasn't really what Luther was talking about. It's one thing to believe that faith in grace is all we need, but actually having that faith, moving beyond a shameful and guilty self-concept, isn't easy. The course's process of growing in faith involves looking at this guilty self-concept and undoing it through forgiveness, which begins when we're willing to consider that what we condemn in someone else is what we have condemned in ourselves. It's this condemnation that makes us believe that grace isn't available to us, that we don't deserve it, and so we can't accept it. The Course also recognises that we are resistant to letting go of guilt because it keeps us attached to our autonomous, man-made, ego identity. By clearing a table of all we hold against others and ourselves, we make room to receive the gifts of grace. There's a quote from the Course's workbook. Grace becomes inevitable instantly in those who have prepared a table where it can be gently laid and willingly received, an altar clean and holy for the gift. End of quote. As our faith in grace increases along with our practice of forgiveness, our actions become more spontaneously loving, regardless of the actual form they take. And what helps us speed along the way is understanding, as Horatio remarked in Hamlet, that, quote, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, end of quote. Subtitle, Mystery and Wonder, Developing a Religious Attitude. Faith in grace also means trusting that we're not alone, that we don't have to move through the world on our own steam. We have support, a vital resource, if only we open our minds to it. Here's a quote from the Course. Grace is not learned, yet we prepare for grace in that an open mind can hear the call to waken. It has become aware that there are things it does not know and thus is ready to accept a state completely different from experience with which it is at home. End of quote. We need to accept the limits of our intellect. Our rational mind tries to work things out based on our limited experience and external ideas about what's possible. We rely on the world's logic and linear cause-effect relationships. In his book, Symbols of Transformation, Jung called this kind of thinking directive thinking. It is directed towards the outside world and is adapted to the world's reality. It's a laborious kind of thinking and consumes most of our days. Come midlife, however, we need to develop what Jung called a religious attitude. What Jung meant by a religious attitude was an appreciation for the unseen world, for the numinous. The word numinous is based on the Latin numen, meaning the divine will. It's not the will of our ego, our self-conscious, independent self, but of something greater, all-encompassing. A lack of appreciation for the numinous is the root cause of midlife malaise. According to Jung, this is when the numinous calls for integration, to be heard, just as any instinct requires some attention. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes how a religious attitude is necessary to move beyond the limitations of an ego-centered identity and its competitive nature. Here's a quote from Jung's memoir. The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interests upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. Thus we demand that the world grant us recognition for qualities which we regard as personal possessions, such as our talent or our beauty. The more a man lays stress on false possessions and the less sensitivity he has for what is essential, the less satisfying is his life. He feels limited because he has limited aims, and the result is envy and jealousy. If we understand and feel that here in this life we are already have a link with the infinite, desires and attitudes change. End of quote. Our link to the infinite, according to Jung, is experienced through non-directive thinking, which stems from the unconscious. So, quote, what happens when we do not think directly? Our thinking then lacks the leading ideas and sense of direction emanating from them. We no longer compel our thoughts along a definite track, but let them float, sink, or rise according to their specific gravity. End of quote. This reminds me of Keats' letter to his brothers, in which he uses the term negative capability to describe the ability of great artists to abide in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. That's what Keats said. So you could say that non-directive thinking is being in a place or a state of mind in which we can tolerate uncertainties. We can tolerate not knowing everything, not being able to predict things, not being able to control things. We can abide in a sense of, well, you'd have to be in a sense of trust, really, and faith, which, as Luther says, is necessary to avail yourselves of grace. In those times of uncertainty, I guess that's when we really need faith, but that's also when our faith is really challenged, because with uncertainty comes fear, because the ego would say that there's always something awful around the corner and that we have to control things, we have to control circumstances and people so that we get our needs met, which are really the needs of the body. When we have focused on the body, our physical body, our psychological body, and we feel very much a creature of the world. So the negative capability that Keats is talking about, that great artists have, is that ability to abide in those uncertainties. That's the meaning of the word negative here, how it's being used. The Course says the ego abhors a vacuum because the mind is open and the memory of God can come in. Well, with the artists, they're able to allow their minds to be open. That vacuum can be likened to negative capability, emptiness. And the Buddhists and many Eastern traditions talk about emptiness, being empty the vessel so that you can be inspired, so that you can avail yourself of grace. But again, as we just saw, that requires faith. And I like this way that Keats says, to abide in certainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And that irritable reaching after fact and reason would be what Jung would call directive thinking. We're getting too much in our head, narrow, focused, trying to figure things out. We can't avail ourselves of grace in that mindset. Okay, carrying on to the next subheading, a collaborative venture. Jung viewed philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's psychological demise as an example of what can happen when we try to navigate the difficult process of becoming who we are without an appreciation for the numinous. In his book Concerning Rebirth, Jung wrote the following: Nietzsche's prophetic vision of the tightrope walker reveals the awful danger that lies in having a tightrope walking attitude towards an event to which St. Paul gave the most exalted name he could find. End of quote. Jung is referring to St. Paul's journey along the road to Damascus, during which he had a vision of Jesus and subsequently converted to Christianity. I suspect the exalted name Jung refers to is conversion, a synonym for transformation. Jung saw this event, or St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, as symbolic of a psychological process in which we allow our spiritual self to emerge and begin leading the way. It's a quote from Jung. Christ himself is the perfect symbol of the hidden immortal within the mortal man. End of quote. Nietzsche had written a parable about a tightrope walker trying to navigate two polarities, turning away from the world's values, represented by a tower at one end of the rope, and resisting despair at a meaningless world, represented by a tower at the other end. And the kind of feeling that you associate that with is not having any solid ground under your feet. That is the existential nightmare, if you like, of the tightrope walker. The way out of this dilemma, according to Nietzsche, is to embrace a third value, that of becoming who you are as an individual. This aim makes life meaningful, according to Nietzsche. The trouble is that Nietzsche's idea of who you are has a hint of self-made man about it, and so doesn't embrace the idea of a spiritual egoless self or of grace. On the contrary, it over-evaluates the role of directive thinking, hence the intense tightrope walking attitude that evolves from it. There's nothing looking out for us in Nietzsche's paradigm. It is intensely lonely. The following extract from Jung's Red Book, written during a period of psychological, emotional and spiritual upheaval, shows just how much Jung's attitude differed from Nietzsche's. Quote, "Yes, it is the in-between world, the pathless, the manifold dazzling. I see neither way nor bridge. What I believed about the soul has to become true here, namely that she knows her way better and that no intention can provide her a better one." End of quote. This is why Jung emphasises transformation over creation. This is a quote from Jung from his essay Transformation Symbolism in the Mass. "It is not I who create myself, rather I happen to myself." End of quote. Grace is the sum and substance of such transformation, in which we no longer rely solely on our own steam and intellect, and incorporate an attitude of wonder, grateful for the reality of what lies beyond our understanding. And that is the end of the essay. So, grace, according to A Course in Miracles, it's not something you have to earn. It's not special favour that is bestowed upon people because they've done something to please God. Grace is a part of who we are as a part of God's oneness, and it's something that is available to us now within our minds. Thank you all for listening. Tune in again. Bye.